name is Christian Marin, and this is a summary of the Philippine Revolution. The Philippine Revolution was a battle of freedom between the oppressed people of the Philippines and the Spanish government. The Spanish had been ruling the archipelago of the Philippines for more than 300 years before the revolt, which would eventually end their rule. In 1886, 7 years before the start of the revolution, several middle-class Filipino Catholics fled to England to begin protesting the inhumane rule of the Filipinos in Manila. Many of these people were fighting for their right to religion, as the Spanish had monopolized the Catholic Church and did not allow them to worship freely. After this peaceful means of freedom failed, the creation of the Katipunan, often abbreviated as KKK, was created, which is a brotherhood of men who were willing to fight for their freedom. The KKK was founded by a man named Andres Bonifacio. After the discovery of the Katipunan in late August 1896, the people were ready to fight. After the Spanish found out about the organization, they passed a law limiting their freedom of speech, fearing a revolt, showing their understanding in their weak military. During the next few days, Spanish troops flooded Manila in preparation for war, realizing the real threat of the armed men of the Katipunan. The oppression and inhumane treatment of Filipino people led to a population of men infuriated enough to fight to the death for their freedom. After 3 priests were murdered by the Spanish for being conspirators of the Katipunan, the people of the organization prepared themselves for war and struck the Spanish in a small fight just outside of Manila. After fighting over a period of 3 years and 24 battles, a Filipino general by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo proved himself in the field of battle to be a much better leader than the original one of the Katipunan. Bonifacio was eventually overthrown by Aguinaldo and his men shortly before the signing of a pact. Bonifacio was furious and felt that he had been betrayed by his people of the Katipunan. Bonifacio and his brother tried to flee the country and were caught and executed by Aguinaldo's men shortly after he tried to flee the country. After the Spanish agreed to stop fighting, a pact called the Pact of Baiknabata was signed. This pact stated that in exchange for Aguinaldo and other top military leaders to be exiled to Hong Kong, they promised governmental reform in the Philippines and no more oppression for the people. They also financially compensated Aguinaldo, who had to spend the rest of his life in exile outside the country. Aguinaldo, however, had no intent to stay there and began to buy weapons with Spain's money and send them back to Manila for the people to continue to arm themselves. After the Spanish found out about the armament of Filipino people, they revoked the pact and prepared for another war with the Philippines. They flooded troops back into the islands and fortified their battle stations just as they were before. They began acting harsher and harsher on the people than they did before and enforcing much stricter laws about speech and religion. The Americans, however, were involved at this point. Still mad about their losses during the Spanish-American War, which took place in Cuba, they moved their Pacific Fleet into Manila Bay to begin preparing to destroy the Spanish fleet. At midnight on May 1st, 1898, it took less than 5 hours for the American fleet to completely destroy the fleet of the Japanese and move onto land in Manila. They kicked out the Spanish for good. After the Spanish were gone, the people of the Philippines created the Revolutionary Government of the Philippines. This created laws for the people which did not restrict their freedom. After the Battle of Manila Bay, Aguinaldo rushed back to Manila and named himself president of the government and country. The new government was set up within days of the Spanish leaving the country. The American government decided that instead that their government was going to be too weak and inexperienced to rule an entire country by themselves, so they enforced the American democratic government on them. Eventually, after much arguing and skirmishes close to war, Aguinaldo finally submitted to the Americans and allowed them to rule the archipelago. This was a good call for him and his people, as it allowed them to build up their own government skills while being ruled by a humane country who did not exploit them for power. Overall, this benefited the entire country and freed them from any more oppression by the Spanish or any other forces.